G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day. So far a great middle of your week. Now over the past 24 hours, thank you for all the support and messages wishing me luck for my functional MRI today. I had about a 2-hour scan today in a specific functional MRI machine in a medical research centre, just getting some more information about that growth we saw on the tumour in my head. So I'll let you know when I get more results back from that. But thank you very much. But today, as every day, we do have a lot to go over. So, of course, we'll look at the maps in the south, the east, and the north. Now, as well with those maps, we'll look at what pages are saying about specific situations on the ground, as well as we'll line it up with footage and geolocations that give us a better idea of what's moving, what's important about where that movement is, and what sort of munitions are also being used. So we line up that footage that is strategically important to the location. We do have a lot of movements on the map today. And of course, President Volodymyr Zelensky is in the US at the moment, not only speaking at the UN, but also a lot of sideline meetings. Now, primarily, he is there to unveil his victory plan. What we know is a leading into his 10-point peace plan from November in 2022. So we need to talk at length about this. We'll look at what officials in the US have said. We'll look at what Zelensky has said. We'll look even at what Trump has said and more about this as well. So let's get stuck straight into this. Now, I do have a fair bit to go over, but something I want to start at here is we had this come through some talks as well. Now, this was in an interview with ABC that Zelensky has accused Russia of using Chinese satellites to photograph Ukraine's nuclear power plants, perhaps in preparation for possible strikes on them. The recent information is that Russia has been using Chinese satellites and taking photos of the details of the objects on nuclear facilities. And in our experience, if Russia takes photos of certain objects, then there is a threat of strikes against them. Now, again, people are saying this won't be a strike against the facility, it'll be a strike against generators around the facility to try and cut it off to have impact on Ukraine's energy grid if strikes take place. I have spoken at length over the past months about when we get more towards the pointy end of the war, things grow desperate. The chance of false flags, in my opinion, raises significantly. Now, let's talk about Russian or Sino-Chinese ISR capability as well. Now, firstly, China is really the one you need to get on board, I believe, to have any influence on Russia. When we hear things about escalation from using weapons from the West inside of Russia, this doesn't just mean back in Ukraine. I think one of the main things that could escalate is Russia or then using Chinese satellites could potentially then provide ISR information, targeting imagery into places in the Middle East as well where they may have interest. Zelensky did not say whether the Chinese satellites Russia has used were commercial satellites or controlled by the Chinese government. The embassy in Washington did not respond. Now, Zelensky in his UN speech has doubled down on saying this, they, by Russia, preparing to target our nuclear power plants. 3 of them. We have this information and we have proof of this. If Russia is ready to go that far, it means nothing you value matters to Moscow. The UN Charter has no room for this. My question is, after 2.5 years of war, Russia has the initiative on the front line. Why would Russia target these nuclear facilities now? The energy generating facilities around it to try and cut off the grid, I understand going into winter, but the facility itself, what benefit does that give to Russia? I've shown you many times the when and why false flags may come into account, and I think there is growing threats of this, not only maybe from Russia to undermine Ukraine in how it is seen on the global scale, although I don't think that would work really regardless of what Russia did, but also the potential of something being run by Ukraine to draw in NATO in the war, because militarily I can't see the victory of 1991 borders taking place without more involvement directly from NATO. So let's talk about more of this, the plan, what the Czech president has said, and long-range strikes as well. So there hasn't been really much luck for Zelensky while he has been in the States so far. Of course, the 2 big things, victory plan, long-range strikes. Kyiv has long been dependent on receiving target coordinates for strikes with its precision Western weaponry from US military personnel on a base elsewhere in Europe. Without those, the missile is likely to miss its mark, the military official said, and the US states has sometimes declined to provide coordinates for some of Kyiv's desired targets. The official said, the weapons are often used on what we would consider less important targets. US officials argue that Ukraine has such a limited stockpile of ATACMS and similar munitions that opening up Russian territory to strikes would make only a limited impact on the battlefield and could lead to the missiles running out in a matter of weeks. The White House and Defense Department officials say that they have not heard a convincing argument from Ukrainian leaders that the possible targets within missile range in Russia would make a significant difference in Ukraine's path to victory. They say that using missiles against targets in Crimea, as Ukraine has done so far, is a more worthwhile strategy that has already forced the Kremlin to pull forces back from the peninsula. So what is the risk, cost, and reward of these strikes? And the US, I believe, is also looking at this going, what if future relations put in jeopardy from allowing further strikes here as well? One US official maintained that this request is different from past ones because it is not worth the risk of a Russian escalation. Again, I believe you are incorrect if you're saying Russia is not going to escalate, drop a bomb here. I believe that is correct in that they're not going to do that, but I believe you're incorrect in assessing that that is the escalation the US is concerned about. As I brought up early in the video, I believe their concern of escalation is outside of Ukraine. It is technology, ISR, information sharing between other states that it considers its allies, some of these states which are in a proxy war with Israel and the US at the moment in other areas of the world. And we have seen a sharp incline of the amount of technology used by some of those groups. Because the stockpile of missiles is limited and Russia has already pulled 90% of the jets launching glide bombs out of ATACMS range, a changed US policy would not reshape the course of the fighting. This is what we have heard, that a lot of these planes are already well outside of those limits. And I see people pull up, well, look at this strike on this facility by Ukrainian forces in Russia. Again, a lot of those are already outside of the range of ATACMS. What real change would it make? Again, we don't know exactly, but the US is saying here that there's not yet been a convincing argument for this. So let's look at the victory plan. Now, Western officials sought to lower expectations for a plan to end the war that President Volodymyr Zelensky is presenting in New York this week, saying they don't see it ushering in a breakthrough to the conflict with Russia. Now, these officials and people familiar with these conversations and then the victory plans we have not seen yet has said there's no real surprises in the president's so-called victory plan, and it wasn't a major game changer. Another official described it as a wish list. The gloomy assessment of the plan underscores a deepening sense of pessimism among allied nations as the war drags into its third year. And what can this plan actually be? Given where the 10-point peace plan sits, what does the victory plan is a stepping stone to install this that can only be installed, the 10-point peace plan, militarily. You are asking Russia to withdraw out of all of those territories. You're asking them to hand over Putin and other officials as well. That is not going to be done unless it is done militarily. There's idealism and then there's realism in this as well. And that victory plan would have to be a massive amount of support, not only security guarantees, but weapons as well. But it's also going to have to go in line with conscription, volunteer, and how the public is seeing the future and years of war. Now, we do get a little bit more here. The head of the presidential office, Andrew Yermak, noted that Ukraine's invitation to NATO is part of the plan for victory and encouraged partners to ignore Russia's threats of escalation. Again, the escalation may not be inside of Europe. It may be other areas of the world. The US needs to look very wide if it wants to maintain its position in global dominance and influence as well. My honest opinion is NATO, even once the guns fall silent, is still going to take a while for Ukraine to enter into NATO, to meet those standards, meet those minimum points of entry as well. while the war is ongoing, NATO is not going to then allow Ukraine in, even if a lot of those countries want to at this point in time right now. Which countries do you think would say yes and no? More importantly, the ones that can say no and veto it. I believe Germany would say no. I believe the US would. Hungary would. Slovakia would. And probably some others, including Turkey as well. So it's not that one country sitting outside of this. You've got many. Ukraine's entry into NATO, while the guns are still booming, in my opinion, is just not going to occur. So the Czech president said something very interesting as well, that European unity over the war, with the fatigue of 31 months of conflict, is growing everywhere. Ukraine will have to be realistic about its prospects of recovering territory occupied by Russia. The most probable outcome of the war will be that the part of the Ukrainian territory will be under Russian occupation temporarily. He added that it would be a temporary thing that could last years. So not saying give it up, but saying that there's going to be a temporary change. Now, my opinion has always been, I believe that the war will, I don't know what is going to happen with territory into the future, but I believe the lines that we see at the moment is probably going to be very similar to where we see guns fall silent and then diplomatic actions occur after this. Now, Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs pushed back on what Pavel said. The withdrawal of Russian occupying forces from the sovereign territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognised borders is one of the mandatory points of President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky's peace formula. We emphasise that there can be no middle ground solutions when it comes to human lives, freedom, common values, justice for Russia's war crimes, and restoration of international peace and security. In this context, temporary solutions will not bring lasting peace, but will merely postpone war. This is a realistic scenario that we can achieve through joint efforts. Of course, referring to the implementation of Zelensky's peace formula, territorial integrity, then the justice and all the points in this as well. Now, what we have seen is that Russia is strapping in for a lot longer war. This is not showing intentions of the war ending soon. We see, I believe, from Bloomberg that Russia keeps money rolling in for Putin's war, that they will maintain defence spending at a historic high in 25, showing no signs of ending. The government intends to increase defence spending to 142 billion in 2025 from 10.4 trillion rubles, so up from this 13 trillion rubles then this year, putting it at 6.2% of GDP. Military expenditure is planned to decline to 5.6 in 2026 and 5.1 of GDP in 2027, bringing to 40% of Russia's total budget disbursement in 2025. Now, questions are asked as, is this sustainable? Will there be internal collapse as they rise that military spending? So we need to look at some historical examples here as well. And I listened to a podcast recently, I can't remember who it was, but he said, if you're not looking at history to have a look into the future, then you're making stuff up. In World War II, the US spent about 37% of GDP, the UK about 53%. So, of course, much, much higher, but in a very different time as well. The modern thinking from my reading is that anything above 5 to 10% for a prolonged time does risk economic collapse. So that 5 to 10%, as you can see, we round this number, it's much closer to 5, and they're saying between 5 and 10% for a prolonged amount of time does risk that. Of course, we saw an economic collapse in the Soviet Union, and they had spending of between 15 and 20%. So I don't believe that this is imminent. Is it still a factor? Yes, but if we see that reduction as well, again, how long can Russia keep this up for? I think a lot longer than the predictions in the beginning of the war. And if Russia go in more of a defensive posture, they'll be able to have a lot less expenditure for a lot longer as well. We could see them switch into that as well. Of course, this last, let's say, 9 months, they have really been on offensive actions. Now, let's look at what Trump has said in Georgia about this as well. That he talks about that I'll settle the war in Ukraine and I'll end the chaos in the Middle East and I'll prevent something that nobody else will be able to do. I'll prevent World War III. You're close to World War III that Biden and Kamala got us. Remember, he's trying to get people on his side to vote in the way Trump talks. But there's interesting bits in this. Biden and Kamala got us into this war in Ukraine and now they can't get us out. They can't get us out. And we have been saying for 3 years every time that Zelensky comes to the US, he walks away with $100 billion. I think he's the greatest salesman on earth. He says, but we're stuck in a war. Unless I'm president, I'll get it done. I'll get it negotiated. I'll get out. Biden says we will not leave until we win. What happens if they win? That's what they do, is they fight wars. Now, we'll talk about another beat here. Now, there has been talk around some circles that I talk to guys, and some articles I read maybe on the more fringes of this. But what happens if one side win in this, like a victory in this? If Russia have a victory, they occupy Ukraine, what does that show the rest of the world? Are we going to see a rise again of imperialist states coming in, going against the UN Charter and taking over ground and countries? And is China going to go here? And even the US could go here. India will go there. Russia will go here and there. How realistic is that also? But what precedent does it set? On the other side, people are saying the US wants to give enough for Ukraine to defend themselves, but does not want to give Ukraine enough for a victory, for a win. What happens if the US were to give Ukraine enough, if that's possible, in material goods, because that still is not proven to be possible yet? If they give Ukraine enough to have a victory, what state does that leave Russia? Of course, the country with the most deliverable nuclear weapons in the world. Where does that leave Russia there? Now, not only nukes, I've read a lot of articles speaking about even collapse within Russia and refugees to areas in the world as well. So it does sort of hold true that the US is doing enough maybe to defend Ukraine, maybe to slow things down, but with long-range strikes, delivering 30 Abrams when they've got a fucking 5,000 sitting in a field, enough to defend, not enough to win. But we'll read about the next part in here. He's speaking about Russia. That's what they do, is they fight wars. Somebody even told me the other day, they beat Hitler, they beat Napoleon. That's what they do. They fight. Now, I've seen a lot of people pushing back on this about other wars of which Russia may have come out of not winning. Now, the most I see people bring up is actually about Russia in Afghanistan. As an Afghanistan veteran as part of the coalition, maybe not the best example when you're trying to paint Russia and the West in Afghanistan. Yeah, I think the Afghans can walk around like Buffalo Soldier, defeating both the Soviets and the West in some way. But let's speak on this, that they beat Hitler and they beat Napoleon. And Kissinger has a fantastic part about this before we get then into the maps. But talking about Russia, it has started more wars than any other contemporary major power. But it has also thwarted domination of Europe by a single power, holding fast against Charles XII of Sweden, Napoleon and Hitler, when key continental elements of the balance had been overrun. Its policy pursued a special rhythm of its own over the centuries, expanding over a landmass spanning nearly every climate and civilization, interrupted occasionally for a time by the need to adjust its domestic structure to the vastness of the enterprise, only to return again like a tide crossing a beach. From Peter the Great to Vladimir Putin, circumstances have changed, but the rhythm has remained extraordinarily consistent. So, has another part in this that I think relates a little bit. Everything about Russia, its absolutism, its size, its globe-spanning ambitions and insecurities, stood as an implicit challenge to the traditional European concept of international order, built on equilibrium and restraint. So it's interesting to look at, and I think this is part of what Trump is talking about as well. Now, before we get into the frontline situation, let's look at this from, I believe, one of the most straight shooters about what is happening, the realistic situation here, to Tarigami, Ukraine. Unfortunately, the situation on the front line is dire in many areas. These tiring efforts to portray a rosy picture, suggesting that the armed force of Ukraine will soon be in Crimea, are hindering honest discussions and urgent calls for help. Again, I believe I've been portraying a realistic picture of what has been happening over the past 12 months, but I get, of course, a lot of pushback that I think is because I'm not sharing what people want to be hearing, but I think some of that is hindering honest discussions about what is actually happening, what would actually help too. Zelensky is correct to seek binding security guarantees as strong as Article 5 because Ukraine is going to lose the war unless there are radical changes in how this war is approached. Not only for a victory territory, let's forget that for now, but if the war was to end right here, right now, How does that look internally? They need guarantees there to stop further aggression, maybe another invasion, but also what will become internally that state of Ukraine with people leaving, maybe not returning, potential unrest as well. They need guarantees no matter where, I guess, the border line runs. So let's have a look over the maps, and we do have a fair bit to look at here today. Now, let's start at, I believe, the most burning. We'll go down into Vuhledar. Now, we have Vuhledar down here. Now, this map has not changed today, although out just to the west here, Deep State map does show some Russian gains. But we do have a number of other maps showing very different situations in here. Now, let's actually firstly look at what Deep State say about this. That the situation around the city is critical and continues to worsen. The Russians are trying to surround the settlement. At the same time, they're simply razing it to the ground with artillery and FABs. Now, this is somewhat similar to, I guess, deep maneuver warfare, but it is maneuver under fire. If you read through some of the Russian doctrine, there is a lot of this. Mass amounts, the assumption of artillery dominance and maneuver under that amount of fire too. And I believe we're seeing this, and we saw this in other areas of the front too. To hold until the last means to put ruins above the price of our military, which is unacceptable. Today's consequences should have been thought of earlier, but now it's too late. Although the fighters of the 72 Brigade do not give up, and despite everything, they continue to do their work. Now, there are a lot of pages saying that there are a lot of guys potentially going to be surrounded in here. Potentially flyers have also been dropped wanting a surrender, and other units, more full-time units, more professional units have withdrawn, and the defense left here is lower mobilized soldiers. That is what some Russian pages are saying. I'm not saying that's true. Wait and see, but that is what a lot of those are saying. But speak about it getting then raised to the ground. Let's have a look at some of this footage. Again, all these footage you can find on the Telegram. So we see just massive amounts of multiple launch rocket systems then firing on Vuhledar. You both have the left and the right. For the sake of this video, just look on the left one for now. You can just see the amount of multiple launch rockets then hitting Vuhledar. It's better to probably look at where the smoke is coming up rather than strikes itself. And we'll jump across onto this one, and I'll just drag this through so we can speed it up a little bit. You can just see the amount of systems then just flattening Vuhledar before there is a further assault on this. And I don't see how you can defend really against this if you can't take down those like Su-34 aircraft with glide bombs. How do you defend against just flattening an area, making it indefensible, and then moving in? So let's look at the first Syriac map of today. Now, Russian army began assault to the locality of Vuhledar and entered the first buildings on the eastern part. In addition, Russian forces took control of the warehouses north of Pavlivka and new positions northwest of it. So really closing in. So we have Pavlivka right up pretty much where this grey zone is. He's saying is red, but also a break-in into Vuhledar itself. So a full movement then into here. We know Russia has been trying to do this for a long time. The success, we believe, is that withdraw back, right, and try and envelop. Again, that has worked for Russia from Mariupol to Bakhmut to Avdiivka, and now Vuhledar is that envelop and then take. Now, there is a footage here. I don't have the video. I'll chuck it on the Telegram, and we see that this has been raised right at here, which is where my cursor is, I believe, right here. But of course, a further swing around, further enveloping Vuhledar. Russian army managed to complete the capture of this mine. In addition, Russian forces managed to cut off the last route of Ukrainian army in the locality of Vuhledar, which intensified the retreat of the Ukrainian force in the north. Moreover, Russians in the last hours significantly expanded the bridgehead north of this river. So more ground being made in here, both out just to the west too. So Vuhledar, in my opinion, is in a very dire situation currently. We will see what continues to occur in here. Now let's just move our way up the map, and of course we'll come then into the Pokrovsk front line. What we can see here to the north of Krasnohivka out from Nevelsky, there has been a significant advance somewhere in the 4 kilometers seen by this map as well. Movement into Zeleny Persha and the complete capture of Ukrainsk, and more ground to the southeast of Seledove. Now, just as important as this red, I believe, is where we see the grey move. The grey is showing this train line. Remember, other military analysts were saying the most dangerous part for Seladove, it's very defensible against an east to west attack. But on the flanks, this is a big problem, especially if Russia is able to get to the train line on the flank and then the maneuver fire support across there. So let's look then further at this. Now, we're going to break this up into two different maps. But here we have situation, Pokrovsk and Northwest Donetsk. Russian army reached the railway west of this mine. So this is the railway where that grey zone shifted. Grey zone shift, this showed we know there was some level of movement. In addition, Russian forces not only secured Zeleny Persha, but took control over Zeleny Druin, cutting the supply with the salient of then Novelsky. So they took control over Zeleny Druin, which is a long way down, right down in here. Again, this is the road out of the Novelsky salient in here. There's significant changes happening on these maps. Again, Deep State showed advancement there. Surak showed more advancement, so it's somewhere in between. Now let's have a look here. This is showing this close-up of the Novelsky salient. Of course, significantly more than the Deep State is showing, but also the amount of ground out from Ukrainsk, which is very similar to what the Deep State is showing as well. So more ground made on Pokrovsk. What I will be interested to see, the September sort of roundup of how much ground was made in September, as I do believe it might be the most amount of ground made this year through the months. And we have seen an increase in the amount of ground and speed that Russia is able to occupy in Ukraine. If you graph that, it lines up very much on par with another offensive into the north. So let's then look our way up the maps. Now, we do see just in Nevsky here a little bit of ground made by the Russians, confirmed by Deep State map. Now, this isn't being shown on this map, but we do know previous maps did show more ground made in here. Then we go up into Pishani, where we have seen some changes, and then we will see out to then the south that Russian army made new advances towards Krulekivka as well. So further down in here, look, these are fairly close, maybe just a little bit more, but realistically still showing fairly close. Now we're going to come up into Volchansk. There is a Ukrainian advancement in here today. We see this blue pop up. I'll show you because this is easier. We see from there to there, and we do get footage as well, said to be of the Ukrainian Special Force. Oh, I'm on, sorry, the wrong map here. I'll show you the footage. Footage again, full telegram, because this is a couple of minutes long. But Ukrainian Special Forces troops in here conducting raids as well. And then we see where the flag is in these areas as well in here. So there was some level of clearing operation. There are reports that there were then hand-to-hand combats take place as well, which is realistic. I personally have a couple of guys I know who were in hand-to-hand combats at some point in Afghanistan too. This could absolutely take place here. We don't really know what the situation ever was out here. There were reports a week ago that Russia managed to actually withdraw the soldiers who were encircled, or at least not just encircled, but dislocated from the main force here. So I think Ukraine has jumped on their chance and then rounded up whatever is left, and the stragglers back there. Syriac is then showing this as well. Battle for Volchansk continuing. 1 month Ukrainian army recapturing the aggregate plant and surrounding buildings. 80% of the town is now under Ukrainian control. Meanwhile, clashes with Russian army continue on the northern outskirts here without changes. Again, I think Russia may just withdraw slowly back out of here, tie up some resources. Like I've said with these two, I don't think Russia ever wanted to actually really hold these long term. I think we could just see a full withdrawal out of here very quickly if it isn't sort of meeting the requirements on other areas on the front. Then we'll come up into, of course, the Kursk offensive, Ukraine's offensive back into Russia occupying ground. Now, let's have a couple of looks. So we do have some updates. No changes shown on this map, but this map has never been that accurate on this area. The bit we're looking at is Vasyole, just down in here. And the Ukraine army managed to enter in Vasyole and a few hundred meters from the first building. So Surak saying there was a Ukrainian advancement in here. In the last 48 hours, Ukraine made small advances north of these farms in Chemyevska. Now, this is very, very hard to see on this map just because the labeling is just not there, but it's right up around in here where Ukraine is said to have made some ground up in here. Now, we'll come down onto then the eastern side of this in and around Borky. Now, this red dot, this is Borky right in here, and you can sort of line up. The best way to do it is probably look at where the border line is. We get this sort of like right angle piece here, and then it's showing it's right up through, sort of cutting off right where my cursor is here. We're taking Ulanok and Borky under control. Well, sorry, pushing back, taking Borky back under control, and a push out from Ulanok as well. Of course, pushing towards Plekovo on this front. But legends, that is all that I have for you today. I hope that you're having a great day, great week, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you.